Today we're talking about the road to revolution. The first question is what fueled the American Revolution? Because if you were looking at the beginning of the 18th century, you wouldn't think that this group of people in the American colonies would be on the cusp of a revolution. For most of the 18th century, they were fairly happy being loyal subjects of the king. They considered themselves to be British, first and last. But by the 1760s, something had changed in colonial society. Something had changed in the American psyche, something that made the American colonists become, as John Adams put it, more attentive to their liberties. The colonists by this point had become discontent with Britain for a variety of reasons, mostly because of a dramatic change that occurred in Britain's policy towards the colonies. So what was this change? Well, Britain began to assert its power in the colonies more aggressively. They began to collect taxes at a higher rate and began to enforce laws much more boldly than they had in the past. And the main reason why Britain changed in this way had to do with various imperial wars. There were four wars fought between the British Empire and France from the years 1689 through 1763. And these wars were fought in Europe, in India, and in North America. So the first war was known as King William's War in the late 1600s. Then there was Queen Anne's War in the early 1700s, and in both of these wars, the English launched expeditions to capture Quebec, which was the capital of New France in North America, but both of these expeditions against the French failed. A big reason why they failed is because the majority of Native Americans who participated in these wars were on the side of the French because the French treated the Native Americans better than the English did. They shared the land more effectively because they were more into fur trading and things like that rather than settling there and farming and taking the land like the English did. Native Americans supported by the French burned English frontier settlements during these wars. But then, eventually, the English were able to take Nova Scotia from France. So not Quebec, but a neighboring province. Then King George's War. That was the third of the four wars fought between the British Empire and France during this time period. And King George's War started when the French and the Spanish allied together and then attacked the British colonies. Specifically, the Spanish attacked the colonists in Georgia, and the French attacked the colonists in New England. So American colonists in Georgia and New England did most of the fighting for the British. They repulsed Spanish attacks. They captured a French fort. But then in the peace treaty that ended the war, the British gave France back the fort that the New England colonists had fought so hard for, fought to capture. And this made them angry. This made the New Englanders angry that Britain gave France back Fort Louisbourg in exchange for economic gains in India. If you were in New England, you didn't really care so much about India. What you cared about was that your brother had just fought and died for the king, and now what he fought for was just being given back to the French. So it was at this point that the colonists really learned that their interests came second to the crown's. And these wars really weren't about them. They were fought by the colonists, but they didn't ever really favor the colonists. The wars were always fought to benefit the crown rather than the people fighting the war. And then comes the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, as it's called more globally. And this was the fourth large imperial war that really changed the way that colonists began to view their relationship with the British Empire. So the French and Indian War took place from 1756 through 1763. These are hotly contested dates because the first shots were fired in 1754. George Washington was actually there where the first shots were fired. He was only in his 20s. And the fighting stopped in America around 1760, 61. But these were the official dates from when the British and French declared war to when they signed the Treaty of Paris to end it. So the 1750s and 1760s, this war was fought partly in Europe and partly in America, with some involvement in India as well. The major fighting that took place in North America took place in New York State, Canada, and the Great Lakes region and Ohio River Valley. Those were the major regions where the heaviest fighting took place. But both sides brought in European allies too. The Britain allied with Prussia, and the French allied with Austria. So the British and the French fought this war against each other for very similar reasons to why they fought the other wars. They were competing for territory and for economic and political gain globally. Britain wanted to expand their land west of their 13 colonies on the East Coast. They wanted to get more raw materials for trade, and the land they wanted was occupied by the French. Now, the French had not actively colonized this area they controlled, but they did not want the British to get more powerful. They wanted to keep their trading rights there. They wanted to keep their handful of forts in the Great Lakes region and Ohio River Valley. So they fought back. The people who did most of the actual fighting were American colonists and Native Americans. Britain's fighting was done mostly by colonial militias. There were a handful of Indian tribes who fought for the British, but the majority of Indian tribes did fight for the French because they had a better relationship with the French as a whole. But keep in mind that many Indian tribes saw other Indian tribes as their real enemies, or just as much their enemies as the British or the French, and so loyalties definitely were divided. George Washington was a colonel in the British Army during this war. Some tribes of Native Americans fought for each side, but like I said, the majority for the French because the British were encroaching upon their lands more than the French were. The results of this lengthy war was the loss of the French and the victory of the British. And the British acquired much of France's territory between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River as a result of this war. If you look at that map from before and after the French and Indian War, you can see that France went from, in the top here, having all of this territory right here and Haiti, to having just Haiti. The British and the Spanish acquired the rest of their territory with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. So the French and Indian War very much affected France and Britain. France was considerably weakened by this war, but Britain was also weakened too. While they did gain rights to more territory and really trounced France in the region to make themselves more globally competitive, it was also a very costly war, both in terms of money and in terms of human lives. About 1 million people died during the course of this war, and it also increased Britain's debt by over 50 million pounds, which is an absolute fortune, especially in today's money. But in addition to affecting the French and the British, the French and Indian War very much affected the American colonies too. Because Britain had largely ignored the war in North America in the first couple of years, they had more focused on India and Europe. The colonists were kind of hurt by that. They were confused as to why the British weren't focusing their resources and their strength in North America, where colonists were fighting and dying all the time, and instead didn't really seem to be as preoccupied until much later in the war. They remembered that, and they were still hurt by that once the war ended. Another thing that made colonists dislike the British even more was the fact that Britain chose to pay for the debt that they acquired during the war by taxing the American colonists huge amounts of money. So not only did colonists fight and die to gain this territory from the French for the English, but now they were paying an extra price for having fought this war because now they were being taxed huge sums of money. The people in England itself weren't being taxed so much, but just the colonies. Remember mercantilism. Mercantilism is the economic system the British Empire had that said colonies solely exist for the benefit of the crown. In addition to that, Britain also put into place the Proclamation Line of 1763. So if you look at the map here, that's this red line that really goes down the Appalachian Mountains here. And this was the line that Britain said colonists will not be allowed to cross. So all this territory that was claimed by the French and occupied largely by Indian tribes, this area that was won by the British from the French in 1763, the British now said that colonists are not allowed to travel and settle in this region that they had fought to claim. This was largely to try to avoid conflict with Native American tribes who lived there. But even though this seems to us today as a compassionate gesture to the Indian tribes, it was perceived to be an injustice to the colonists, saying, now we can't even enjoy the fruits of our labor. So these two actions really angered American colonists, and it caused many of them to look for a way to break free from what they deemed the oppressive rule of the British. So the high cost of the French and Indian War led Parliament to tax the colonists at very high rates, like I said, and that made colonists angry. But let's get to a little bit more detail about what these taxes were. First off, the notion of taxes, at least for American colonists who, remember, each of the colonies had a representative assembly by this point, taxes were seen as a necessary responsibility that go alongside with the right of being represented in government, having people you elect who represent your interests in the government. It seemed only fair that if you pay taxes, you should have representatives who determine how your taxes are spent. But the British Parliament had no members from the colonies. The British Parliament was filled with people from the British Isles, but not from the 13 colonies. And so American colonists said that there should be no taxation without representation, that they shouldn't be taxed if they have no representation in Parliament to determine how their tax money is spent. So the first big tax that was passed by the British Parliament on the American colonists after the French and Indian War was called the Stamp Act. And this law required a stamp to be put upon all legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, etc., and stamps cost money. That money would go straight into the treasury of the British Crown. And the colonists responded to this new tax with a boycott of British goods. They said, we're not going to purchase anything from the British anymore. We're going to make our own goods. We're going to make our own paper and not purchase British goods anymore. And this worked. Their refusal to buy British products was very, very effective. And it forced Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act because they were losing money instead of gaining money, which is what they hoped would come from the Stamp Act. So that had a happy ending. But the taxes did not stop there. 2 years later, in 1767, Britain passed the Townshend Act, and this taxed the colonists for all sorts of things: tea, paper, glass, other items that they used every day. Tea was something that was drunk all the time. Several cups a day were drunk by the average colonists, and so this put a lot of economic pressure on them. This basically made the colonists poor, many of them, and so they protested this as well. And Britain reacted much more harshly this time to what they deemed to be insubordination. One reaction that the British had when the colonists protested the Townshend Acts was to increase their troop presence in the colonies. So these British soldiers, they were sent to occupy, kind of patrol the colonies, and they were famously known as redcoats. Now, over the next decade, the colonists and Britain grew further and further apart. And the increased troop presence, especially in the Massachusetts region, was not taken kindly by the colonists. And it led to something known as the Boston Massacre in 1770. So what happened with the Boston Massacre is you had British troops occupying the Customs House and outside the Customs House in Boston, and a crowd, angry by the presence of the troops and by Britain's colonial policies in general, this crowd began to harass the group of British soldiers guarding this customs house. This broke out into a riot as rioters started to throw snowballs, which might seem harmless, but then they started to throw ice chunks. This was in the middle of winter, and they started to throw ice chunks at the British soldiers. They started to throw oyster shells, rocks. Eventually, a British soldier was knocked down and accidentally fired off his musket, and this sparked a volley into the crowd that killed 5 American civilians, including a man named Crispus Attucks, who was seen as the first casualty of the American Revolution. Now, this is certainly a tragedy. You have 5 people killed. But as far as number of people who were killed, 5 does not seem like it would warrant the name massacre. It was a relatively minor shooting, but it was named the Boston Massacre in the American newspapers in order to stir up colonial support for independence from Britain. They wanted to make it seem worse than it is. Say, hey, not only are the British killing us, they're massacring us, which is way worse than that. Also, many American papers did not mention the fact that the British soldiers were provoked. But one person who was determined to get down to the truth of what actually happened was John Adams, who was in his 30s at the time, and he was a Boston lawyer, and he took the job that no one else wanted, to defend the redcoats who had killed the 5 Americans in the Boston Massacre. And by showing that they were provoked and that their lives were in danger when they sparked the volley that was largely accidental, John Adams was able to secure a not guilty verdict for the redcoats who were convicted. But this animosity continued, and in 1773, British Parliament passed the Tea Act, and this heavily taxed tea. The colonists drank a ton of tea, and so this really hurt their pocketbook. Angered by the Tea Act, a group of colonists who called themselves the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams, they disguised themselves as Native Americans. Then they snuck into the British trade ship in Boston, the East India Company ships, and they dumped nearly $1 million worth of East India Company tea into Boston Harbor and said, hey, if we can't afford this tea, then no one's going to get this tea. And they dumped it into the Boston Harbor, something that became known as the Boston Tea Party. People who resisted British occupation and taxation called themselves patriots, and those who were loyal to Britain, which was still about 20% of Americans up until the end of the American Revolution, those people were called Tories or Loyalists. In 1774, British Parliament passed something that became known to the Americans as the Intolerable Acts. This was another example of media spin that the American press called it the Intolerable Acts because they couldn't tolerate them and said that no one could. This legislation stripped Massachusetts of the right to self-government and judicial independence. This was a reaction to the Boston Tea Party, and this is when the British Parliament said, if you can't act like adults, then we're not going to treat you like adults. You don't get self-government, you don't get judicial independence, you don't get an assembly anymore. And the colonies responded to these acts with a general boycott of all British goods. And then representatives from each of the colonies met at Philadelphia in what became known as the First Continental Congress in 1774. And they said, things are getting real. I think we need to form an army just to be safe. And that's exactly what happened. Now, as Americans abandoned their loyalty to the king in favor of independence and the founding of a new free nation without a king, they looked to the moral philosophy and political theory of a new movement known as the Enlightenment. Well, what was the Enlightenment? Starting around 1700, this was an intellectual and philosophical movement that really dominated the world of ideas in both Europe and America. It's also known as the Age of Reason, which replaced the Age of Faith. So the Enlightenment brought all these new ideas about human nature and what our rights are and what government should be and the duty we have to one another, ideas like democracy and equality and freedom of speech and things like that, separation of church and state. These were the kind of ideas that the Enlightenment brought up. So now that Americans are wanting to abandon their loyalty to the king and have a free, non-monarchy government, they look to the Enlightenment for an intellectual foundation to support their new views. I'm just going to go over a couple of the big Enlightenment thinkers and some of the ideas they brought about that the Americans latched onto. Well, there were 2 English writers in the Enlightenment that were incredibly influential, named John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. So even though they were very influential, both of them, they also came to very different conclusions about government and human nature. And in order to explain this, I like to give an example that hopefully many of you will understand. Captain America and Iron Man. Okay, one of these men was more like Captain America, and the other was like Iron Man. I'll get more to that, more on that analogy in just a second. So Thomas Hobbes, he believed that there would be a war of every man against every man if there were no government. And for that reason, he said government is necessary. Okay, not too controversial yet. I think most people would agree with that. But he said to avoid this war, people formed a social contract, which is basically an agreement between people and their government. But he said in a social contract, we give up some of our rights to the government in order to gain their protection. And he said, with the formation of any good government, that is the only way for people to live in a safe and orderly way. Therefore, according to Thomas Hobbes, the best government was a strong monarchy, a monarchy where people gave up willingly some of their rights to it, did not have as much autonomy over their own lives, but at the same time made the government more powerful in order to protect them. Well, John Locke came to the opposite conclusion. He believed that people have three natural rights: life, liberty, and property. That everyone is entitled to life, to not be killed if they are innocent. They are entitled to liberty, to live as free men and women. And they're entitled to pursue the ownership of property and not be denied that for arbitrary reasons. And Locke said that the purpose of government is to protect these rights, not necessarily to make sure everyone is living a comfortable, happy life, but to protect these rights so that we can make that a reality for ourselves. And Locke said that when a government fails to protect these natural rights of their citizens, then people have a right, sometimes even a responsibility, to overthrow that government because it's no longer doing its job. So as you see, these two men were very different. Hobbes believed that the primary purpose of government was to provide safety and order for its people, and Locke believed that the primary purpose of government was to protect people's natural freedom. So their big disagreement was, what is the purpose of government? What is it for? Is it to secure freedom, or is it to provide safety and security? And this is where I get to Captain America and Iron Man. The movie Captain America Civil War, you have the Sokovia Accords, which is this legal document that Captain America, that Iron Man wants the Avengers to sign, which will give the government power over the Avengers' superpowers. He said we need to be kept in check. We're way too powerful, and we need to give up our right to use our power whenever we want for the safety of everybody else. But then Captain America says, no, we need the right to choose when to use our powers, and we shouldn't be giving this over to a government. Governments have agendas, and agendas change, he says. Therefore, we need to keep our liberties and use them as we see fit. So in that way, Thomas Hobbes is much more like Iron Man, and John Locke is much more like Captain America. But both writers were very influential to the American Revolution. However, Locke was much more so. Another new idea that the Enlightenment brought about was the separation of church and state. This is the belief that the government should be secular, meaning non-religious, but should still protect religious freedom. And this was a fairly new concept. Most of the 13 colonies had sectarian churches. They had established churches that were funded by tax money. And so this idea that a country should not have an established church, should not preferentially treat some religions better than others, should not ban certain beliefs, this was fairly new. But the purpose of this was to protect the state from the church, but it was also to protect the church from the state. Religious leaders did not want the state to encroach upon their sovereignty within their own walls and didn't want the state to tell them what they could and could not believe or do. So Enlightenment thinkers believed that government should not get involved in religion and vice versa. The French thinkers of the Enlightenment were collectively known as the philosophes. They would meet in these French salons, and they would talk about all of these new ideas. This is when some people say that the Enlightenment kind of got off the rails, because this is when it became explicitly anti-Christian. At least with some thinkers, it became anti-Christian. But some philosophers did have perfectly fine ideas, some of which were even used to found America, as we'll get to. So the philosophers believed that the only way to find truth was through reason. This is where I get to the idea of it kind of being anti-Christian, because they believed in using reason and a scientific view of life, and that only through that can people gain freedom and can societies obtain progress. So this means that sacred texts and church authority, those no longer held water for the philosophers, that they were not to be trusted. That reason was supposed to be held far over faith. Now, the three most influential philosophers were named Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. Voltaire was someone who famously said, "I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." So the idea of freedom of speech. People should be allowed to say whatever they want as long as it's not inciting violence. He also fought for freedom of religion. He himself was not religious, but he believed that people should be allowed to pursue the religion that their conscience tells them is correct. Baron Montesquieu, he advocated for the division of powers or branches of government. The Spirit of Laws was a book that he wrote, and in this book, he says that no one person should have absolute power. It needs to be divided up into branches of government, okay, separation of powers. And then Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of the famous things he professed is that all men are created equal. And it's because of that he supported the abolition movement. He was the secular leader of the abolition movement, and William Wilberforce was the religious leader of the abolition movement around the same time. Another Enlightenment idea was capitalism, founded by Adam Smith. He was a Scottish economist, and in 1776 he wrote the massively successful and influential book, The Wealth of Nations. And in this book, he advocated for free market capitalism in order to replace mercantilism. He said mercantilism only benefits the few at the top, but capitalism can benefit everybody. He said with capitalism, everyone should pursue his own economic interests, and the invisible hand of the market will take care of the rest. He said what a free market does is it uses the selfishness that is in all of us for human nature, and it uses that selfishness for good. Because if you sell something, the only way you are going to sell a lot of it is if you put a fair price on it. And that is going to be good not just for you, but also for the consumer, because they won't have to pay an exorbitant fee. So Smith said that government should not try to control the economy. One phrase he used was laissez-faire, which is French for leave alone, that the government should leave the economy alone, let things naturally run their course, and said that this would be the best economic system. And this was the economic system that America was founded upon. Now, since most Enlightenment ideas were very anti-monarchy, they were much more pro-democracy, there were a group of monarchs in Europe who saw these changes that were coming and became nervous that their days were numbered, that there were going to be revolutions and that their authority would be overthrown. And so they embraced some ideas of the Enlightenment. And this group of kings and queens, including Catherine the Great of Russia, Frederick the Great of Prussia, I think Joseph II of Austria, these were known as the enlightened despots. And they focused on matters to benefit their people instead of just on territorial expansion. That was an Enlightenment idea. They claimed to be peaceful and allowed some democratic voting in their empires, but they never went so far as to embrace an end to monarchy, because that would have dethroned themselves. But in this way, they blended Enlightenment ideas with traditional ideas and were able to keep power by giving their people a little bit more freedom. However, one king that had no use for Enlightenment ideas was King George III of England. He had no tolerance for Enlightenment ideals, and Americans used his obstinacy as evidence for the righteousness of their cause in the American Revolution. So, by 1775, most American colonists felt oppressed by the British Crown, and they had Enlightenment philosophy to justify and explain these feelings of injustice that they believed in. They were kind of thumbing their noses at the king and Parliament at every turn. And Britain was increasingly tightening its grip on the 13 colonies in reaction to this. Former loyalists started to favor rebellion as they started to feel British pressure more and more. And by this point, the American mind had really become fiercely independent. The American colonists stopped really seeing themselves as British anymore, but started to see themselves as Americans. And American optimism, which is one of the abiding qualities of Americans, at least at that time, made colonists think that anything was possible if only the British were to leave their country. So a Continental Army was formed. George Washington was named the commander of the Continental Army. Lawyers, politicians, and journalists continued to fan the flames of discontent with pamphlets and speeches. People like Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death." Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense, which said it's only common sense that we need to break away from the British Crown, and he used passages from the Bible as well as from Enlightenment thinkers to justify that. And then finally, in 1775, British combat troops arrived on Massachusetts shores, and the American Revolution began. All right, we will pick up there next time.